It was 12:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, exactly 48 hours after I watched my son say his wedding vows. I was lying in bed in the dark, listening to the heavy autumn rain pounding against the roof of our home when my phone suddenly vibrated on the wooden nightstand. The sudden buzzing sound made my chest tighten. I reached over and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID said, Victor. He was the general manager of the upscale downtown restaurant, where we had just hosted the extravagant wedding reception. I answered the phone quickly, keeping my voice down to a harsh whisper. Before I could even ask why he was calling so incredibly late, Victor cut me off. His voice was not smooth and professional like it usually was. It was trembling. He sounded breathless and deeply uncomfortable. He said, Rick, I am so sorry to bother you at this hour, but my staff and I were going over the security footage from the VIP lounge on Saturday night. You need to come down here right now. You need to see this tape for yourself. I sat up straight, the cold air hitting my bare shoulders. I asked him what he meant, wondering if there had been a robbery or a dispute with the final bill. Victor paused for a long time. I could hear him taking a very shaky breath through the receiver. Then he dropped the words that would eventually burn my entire existence to the ground. He said, Come alone. And whatever you do, Rick, do not tell your wife anything. If you are listening to my voice right now, I need you to pay very close attention, because the devastating betrayal I am about to share with you did not come from strangers in an alleyway. It came from the very people who slept under my roof, the people I bled for, the people I trusted blindly. Before I take you inside that cold security room to show you what I saw, please let me know in the comments below where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that a man's lifetime of brutal hard work and sacrifice should be respected, not manipulated and stolen. Because what I witnessed on those glowing monitors changed me from a loving, forgiving father into a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. I hung up the phone and sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. I slowly turned my head and looked over at the other side of the bed. Diane, my wife of 35 years, was sleeping peacefully. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady, comforting rhythm. In the dim shadows of the bedroom, she looked like the exact same innocent woman I fell in love with all those decades ago. The loyal woman who stood by my side when I was just a 20-something kid with a perpetually bruised back and empty pockets. Slowly trying not to make a single sound, I slid out from under the heavy down comforter. I grabbed my faded jeans and a thick flannel shirt from the armchair, creeping out into the hallway to dress in the dark. My mind was spinning out of control. Why would Victor specifically tell me to hide this from Diane? We shared absolutely everything. There were no dark secrets in my house. At least that was the comforting lie I had been telling myself for months. I grabbed my heavy truck keys from the kitchen counter and stepped out into the freezing, relentless rain. The heavy engine roared to life, cutting violently through the quiet peace of our affluent suburban neighborhood. As I drove down the slick, empty highway toward the neon glow of the city limits, the frantic rhythm of the windshield wipers felt like a ticking clock. My large, calloused hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. My thoughts drifted forcefully back to Saturday night. The beautiful, flawless wedding. I had calmly written a check for $120,000 to cover that single evening. We had towering ice sculptures, crates of imported French champagne, and a 10-piece live orchestra. I paid for every single extravagant detail without a single second of hesitation or regret. Why would I hesitate? Bradley was my only son, my pride, my legacy, and my absolute joy. I spent 40 brutal years breaking my physical body to give him that kind of luxurious life. I started out pouring concrete in the punishing, freezing Chicago winters, my hands cracked, blistered, and bleeding by the time I came home for dinner. I breathed in toxic drywall dust and fiberglass until my lungs constantly ached, taking on double and triple shifts. I willingly sacrificed my own youth and my own health so my family would never have to worry about a leaking roof over their heads or going to sleep with empty stomachs. Over 4 agonizing decades, I slowly turned a rusty pickup truck and a canvas bag of cheap tools into a massive commercial construction empire worth over $8 million. I did it all for them. I built a towering fortress of wealth to protect my wife and son from the humiliating poverty I grew up in. So as I drove my truck through that violent storm, splashing heavily through deep puddles, I felt a sickening, heavy knot twisting deep in my stomach. A protective father knows when something is terribly wrong. My instincts, sharply honed from years of surviving in a cutthroat, unforgiving industry, were screaming at me to prepare for war. I finally pulled into the wet, empty restaurant parking lot. The large neon sign above the entrance was switched off. The main dining area was completely pitch black save for a single flickering yellow light bulb illuminating the damp alleyway in the back. I parked my truck, stepped out into the freezing rain, and walked toward the heavy steel service door. Victor was already standing there, waiting in the cold for me. He was a very poised, professional man, usually dressed in a crisp, tailored suit, with a warm, welcoming smile for all his wealthy guests. But tonight, he looked pale, exhausted, and genuinely sick to his stomach. He did not even offer a polite greeting or shake my hand. He just pushed the heavy metal door open and nodded grimly for me to step inside. The air in the kitchen was stale and smelled strongly of cold cooking grease and bleach. We walked in complete suffocating silence down a narrow windowless concrete hallway toward the manager's private office. Every heavy step I took echoed loudly off the cinderblock walls. Victor unlocked the door to the security room and stepped aside. The small walls were lined with brightly glowing monitors showing different angles of the dark, empty restaurant. He pulled up a worn leather chair and gestured nervously for me to sit down. My knees suddenly felt weak, but I forced myself to stand tall. I am a 70-year-old man. I have faced down violent union strikes near bankruptcies and shattered bones. But looking at the pure pity in Victor's eyes, I felt a cold, creeping terror I had never experienced before. He reached for the computer mouse, his hand visibly shaking, and clicked on a digital file labeled VIP Lounge Saturday Night. The main screen went black for a second. Then the grainy high-definition color footage slowly faded in. I braced myself, staring intensely at the screen, completely unaware that what I was about to witness in the next 2 minutes would not just break my heart. It would completely murder the man I used to be. The screen flickered softly, casting a pale blue glow across the cramped, windowless security room. The digital timestamp flashing quietly in the bottom right corner read, Saturday 11:45 at night. The grand wedding reception was winding down by that exact point. I vividly remembered where I was during those very minutes. I was out in the main ballroom shaking hands with the tired catering staff, making sure the waiters got a generous cash tip for their incredible hard work. But on the glowing monitor, hidden away inside the soundproof VIP lounge, was my family. My wife Diane, my son Bradley, and his new bride Megan. They were sitting casually together on the plush leather sofas, completely out of sight from the rest of the world. The very first thing that struck me, even before a single word was spoken, was their body language. There was an ugly, arrogant looseness to the way they carried themselves. Megan, the girl who had played the shy, humble, and endlessly grateful bride all evening, was slouched heavily back into the couch. She had her bare feet propped unapologetically up on the expensive mahogany coffee table. She held a tall glass of imported champagne in one hand and was laughing sharply at something Bradley had just whispered. Bradley looked completely foreign to me. The emotional, teary-eyed boy who had hugged me at the altar just hours earlier was entirely gone. His posture was hard, impatient, and utterly dismissive. And then there was Diane. My beautiful, devoted Diane. She was sitting perfectly straight, sipping her drink with a cold, calculating expression I had never once seen in our 35 years of marriage. Victor reached forward with a trembling hand and adjusted the volume dial on the desk. The audio kicked in with a soft, crackling, static hiss. On the screen, Bradley reached deep into the inner breast pocket of his custom-tailored tuxedo, the very same tuxedo I had personally paid for. He pulled out the crisp, white envelope I had handed him just 2 hours earlier in the dressing room. Inside was my wedding gift to the newlyweds, a certified cashier's check for $500,000 meant to help them buy their first home and start a family without ever knowing the burden of financial stress. Bradley ripped the envelope open. He did not smile. He did not look touched or grateful. He pulled the heavy check out, glanced down at the massive 6-figure number, and let out a short, mocking scoff. He tossed the precious piece of paper onto the table like it was a worthless gum wrapper. He leaned his head back and sneered. Well, the old man finally coughed it up. 500 grand. Not bad for a night of playing the dutiful, loving son. Sitting in that freezing cold security room, I felt the air violently leave my lungs. My chest tightened so severely, I genuinely thought I was having a massive heart attack. I gripped the hard plastic edges of my chair until my knuckles burned and my fingers went entirely numb. I desperately wanted to look away, to close my eyes, and wake up from this nightmare, but my gaze was hopelessly glued to the glowing monitor. I had poured my actual blood and sweat into every single dollar of that money. I had missed family holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries, working on dangerous construction sites in the freezing rain to build the wealth he was currently mocking. But the absolute worst of the nightmare was just beginning. On the screen, Diane casually set her crystal glass down on a coaster. She did not defend me. She did not scold our son for his profound, sickening disrespect. Instead, she let out a low, chilling laugh that made my blood run freezing cold. She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a thick, folded manila folder. She leaned across the low table and handed it directly to Bradley. Her voice, crisp and unnervingly calm, echoed loudly through the small computer speakers. She said, "The money is just pocket change, Bradley. Focus on the real prize." Bradley opened the heavy folder and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He eagerly scanned the front page, a slow, wicked, and greedy grin spreading across his face. He looked up at his mother and asked, "Did he actually sign it?" Diane nodded. Her face was an absolute mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She leaned forward and said, "He signed it. He thinks it is the marriage witness certificate. The poor senile fool did not even put on his reading glasses. It is the full medical power of attorney. By Tuesday, we put him in the facility. The doctor is already paid off and waiting for our call. Once he is officially declared mentally incompetent, we freeze the entire estate. All $8 million. You take the construction company, and I take the liquid assets. We never have to deal with his stubborn, old-fashioned rules ever again." Victor quickly reached out and paused the video. The frame froze permanently on Diane's smiling, treacherous face. The small room plunged into a suffocating, terrifying silence. Victor looked down at the linoleum floor, completely unable to meet my eyes. He whispered softly that one of the young busboys had gone into the room to clear empty glasses and overheard them talking. The terrified boy came straight to Victor, and Victor immediately pulled the security tapes. I did not say a single word. I simply could not speak. The betrayal was so massive, so perfectly calculated, and so utterly evil that it shattered my entire reality into a million jagged pieces. Every single memory, every kiss, every warm family dinner over the last 3 decades was suddenly infected with a deadly rotting poison. I sat there in the dark, breathing heavily through my nose, trying desperately to process the sheer magnitude of the evil I had just witnessed. I vividly remembered standing at the altar. I remembered Diane sweetly handing me a fancy silver pen and pointing to a blank line on a thick embossed document, telling me it was a special keepsake marriage certificate the state required for the church. I had signed it with tears of absolute joy in my eyes. I had blindly signed away my freedom, my mind, and my entire life's work with a proud smile on my face. They were actually going to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. They were going to drug me, strip me of my basic human rights, and steal my hard-earned empire while I rotted away in a locked white room. The intense, agonizing pain in my chest slowly began to change. The crushing, suffocating grief deep inside my soul metastasized into something completely different. Something cold, dark, and utterly unforgiving. I slowly stood up from the heavy chair. My weak legs were no longer shaking. My calloused hands were completely steady. I looked over at Victor. I reached into my leather wallet, pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills, and laid them gently on his desk. I told him to keep the footage perfectly safe and to thank his brave busboy for saving my life. I walked out of that suffocating security room and back out into the freezing midnight storm. The heavy rain hit my face violently, washing away the last remaining traces of the naive, loving father I had been just an hour ago. I had exactly 4 days until Tuesday. 4 short days to completely dismantle the lives of the people who were trying to destroy mine. I climbed back into my heavy truck and started the engine. I had to go home. I had to crawl back into bed next to the woman who was actively planning my execution. The drive back to our suburban estate was a blur. The rhythmic thumping of the wipers was the only sound keeping me anchored to reality. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my mind consumed by a storm of dark thoughts. For 35 years, my home had been my ultimate sanctuary. It was the one place where I could take off my muddy boots, leave the brutal stress of the construction business at the front door, and simply be a father. I personally laid the brick foundation of that house. I sanded the oak floors before Bradley was born. Now pulling my truck into the driveway, the massive house in the darkness did not look like a sanctuary. It looked like a maximum security prison. It looked like a tomb. I put the truck in park and sat for a long moment, letting the freezing rain wash over the windshield. I had to compose myself. I could not storm inside and start screaming. If I confronted her without a plan, she would use my anger against me. She would call the police, claim I was having a delusional episode, and move up her timeline to lock me away. I took a deep breath, forcing the violent rage down into my stomach. I stepped out into the rain, walked up the front steps, and quietly unlocked the heavy oak door. The house was completely silent, save for the humming of the heating unit. I carefully took off my wet jacket and hung it in the foyer. That was when I noticed the warm light spilling out from the kitchen at the end of the hallway. My chest tightened immediately. I walked slowly down the corridor, every step feeling like I was walking toward a firing squad. As I turned the corner, I saw her. Diane was standing by the marble kitchen island. She was wearing her pale pink cashmere robe, the one I bought for her during our trip to Aspen 2 years ago. Her silver hair was tied up loosely, and she looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly innocent. The electric kettle clicked off, and a gentle cloud of steam rose into the air. The soothing aroma of chamomile and honey instantly filled the kitchen. Under normal circumstances, coming home to my beautiful wife making tea in the middle of a rainy night would have filled my heart with gratitude. But tonight, that sweet smell made my stomach violently turn. She turned around, holding 2 ceramic mugs, and gave me a soft, loving smile. Her eyes, those familiar brown eyes I trusted for over 3 decades, crinkled at the corners with genuine affection. "Rick, sweetheart." "You scared me to death," she whispered, handing me a steaming mug. I woke up and the bed was empty. "Where on earth did you go in this terrible weather?" I stared down at the hot tea. My entire body was screaming at me to throw the boiling liquid directly into her deceitful face. I wanted to grab her by her shoulders and demand to know why she hated me so much. I wanted to ask how much the crooked doctor charged to ruin my life. But I forced my jaw to relax. I forced the muscles in my face to soften into a mask of tired confusion. I looked up at her and let out a heavy sigh. "I just could not sleep, Diane," I muttered. keeping my voice low and raspy. My back was aching from the damp cold, and I thought a quick drive would clear my head. "I am sorry I worried you." Diane reached out and gently placed her warm hand against my cheek. Her touch, which had comforted me through decades of hardship, now felt like a venomous snake crawling across my skin. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to violently flinch and pull away. "Oh, my poor darling," she cooed gently, rubbing her thumb across my cheekbone. "You have been pushing yourself far too hard lately. The wedding took so much out of you. You really need to start resting more, Rick. Your mind needs a break." There it was. The subtle, expertly crafted psychological manipulation. The gentle groundwork she was laying to convince me and everyone around us that my mind was slowly failing. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the chamomile tea. It tasted like ash in my mouth. I nodded slowly, playing the part of the tired, aging man she desperately needed me to be. "You are probably right," I whispered, staring down at the kitchen floor. "I am just getting old, Diane." She smiled that sickeningly sweet smile and wrapped her arms around my waist, pulling herself close to my chest. I stood like a stone statue, breathing in the scent of her lavender perfume, trapped in the most suffocating embrace of my life. She whispered that she would always take care of me, no matter what happened. The psychological torture of standing in my own kitchen, listening to my wife promise to care for me while knowing she just orchestrated my institutionalization, was unbearable. I realized then that every corner of this beautiful home was a carefully designed trap. Every smile shared, every meal cooked, every gentle word spoken was a calculated lie meant to keep me blind while they dug my grave. I gently pulled away from her embrace, feigning extreme exhaustion. "Let us go to bed," I said quietly. We walked down the dark hallway together, her small hand resting lightly on my lower back. I climbed back under the heavy comforter, lying stiffly in the dark, while she settled in beside me. She fell asleep within minutes, her breathing returning to a peaceful rhythm. I lay perfectly awake for the rest of the night, staring at the dark ceiling. I was sleeping next to my executioner, and I knew that when the sun finally came up, I had to begin the fight for my life. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting long, cold shadows across the bedroom floor. I had not slept a second. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, the horrific image of my son tossing that $500,000 check onto the table flashed in my mind. I listened to the soft rustle of the bedsheets as Diane finally stirred awake. She stretched her arms, let out a yawn, and turned to face me with that same sickeningly sweet smile she wore in the kitchen hours ago. "Good morning, my handsome husband," she whispered, her voice laced with a gentle affection that made my skin crawl. I forced a smile back, a painful, heavy gesture requiring every ounce of my strength. "Good morning, Diane," I replied, keeping my voice raspy and low. I carefully sat up on the edge of the mattress, rubbing my face with my rough hands. Today was Wednesday. I had exactly 3 days left before they planned to drag me out of this house and lock me in a psychiatric ward. I needed to see exactly how deep her web of lies went. I needed to watch her lie directly to my face in the stark light of day. We walked down to the kitchen to start our daily routine. I sat at the marble island, while she moved gracefully around the room, brewing dark roast coffee and frying bacon. The domestic normalcy of the scene was absolutely terrifying. I watched her perfectly manicured hands carefully crack eggs into a porcelain bowl. These were the exact same hands that had handed over the legal documents to destroy my entire existence. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and decided it was time to cast my bait. I cleared my throat, adopting a look of mild, helpless confusion. "Diane, honey," I mumbled slowly, staring down at my empty ceramic coffee mug. "I have been racking my brain all morning, but I just cannot seem to remember something from the wedding reception." Diane wiped her hands on a linen towel and walked over to me, her eyes entirely focused and attentive. What is it, Rick? You know, weddings are always such a chaotic whirlwind, she said soothingly. I furrowed my brow, acting like a confused, vulnerable old man. That paper I signed in the dressing room, I said hesitantly. The one you told me was the church registry certificate. For some reason, I woke up thinking it looked like some kind of legal contract. What exactly did I sign? Diane did not miss a single beat. Her facial expression did not change. She simply let out a soft, patronizing chuckle and reached across the counter to stroke my cheek. "Oh, Rick, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with a sickly, manufactured pity. "You are getting everything all jumbled up again. That was just the standard annual tax form for our joint retirement account. Greg sent it over last week, remember? We needed to get it signed before the end of the fiscal quarter." I stared into her warm brown eyes, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer perfection of her lie. She lied with the effortless grace of a seasoned predator. She gently patted my cheek and sighed heavily. "Your memory is really slipping lately, darling," she murmured, shaking her head with a look of profound sorrow. "It is just like yesterday morning, when you completely forgot to lock the garage door before we left for the grocery store. Anyone could have walked right in and stolen your expensive tools. We really need to talk to the doctor about your cognitive decline when we go in for your evaluation next week." "I am getting so worried about you, Rick." As those poisonous words left her mouth, a sickening wave of realization crashed over me. The scattered, confusing puzzle pieces of the last 6 months suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. It was not just the garage door. My mind raced back through dozens of tiny, frustrating incidents that I had previously brushed off as normal aging. 3 months ago, I spent 2 frantic hours tearing the house apart looking for my heavy truck keys, only for Diane to suddenly find them buried at the bottom of the laundry basket. She had planted them there. Last month, I was locked out of my online banking account because the password had been mysteriously changed. Diane told me I must have reset it and forgotten. She had been the one changing my passwords. She was systematically manufacturing evidence of my mental decline. Every lost item, every misplaced document, every forgotten conversation was a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed to make me doubt my own sanity. She was not just stealing my money. She was trying to break my spirit. The horrifying truth expanded even further. I remembered our dinners at the country club. I remembered how Diane would subtly pull our old friends aside, whispering to them with a tragic, tearful look on her face while glancing back at me. I always assumed she was just gossiping. Now I knew the chilling reality. She was planting the seeds of my demise. She was telling our entire social circle that her poor, hard-working husband was developing early-onset Alzheimer's. She was building a wall of public sympathy for herself. So when Tuesday arrived and the men in white coats came for me, nobody would ask a single question. Everyone would praise Diane for being a devoted wife. I looked at the woman in front of me humming a tune as she plated my breakfast. She was a monster behind a sweet smile. I slowly nodded, offering her a defeated look. "You are right, Diane," I whispered quietly. "My memory is playing tricks on me. Thank you for taking good care of me." I lowered my head and began to eat, knowing I had to play the dying victim perfectly, while secretly preparing to burn her world to the ground. The rest of that Wednesday passed in a suffocating blur of agonizing fake smiles and completely forced small talk. I spent the entire afternoon sitting in my worn leather armchair, silently watching Diane move around the living room, watering her expensive orchids and humming softly to classical music. It was absolutely terrifying how easily she wore the flawless mask of a devoted wife. Every single time she stopped to check on me, asking sweetly if I was warm enough or if I needed a fresh glass of water, my stomach tied itself into violently tight knots. By the time Thursday morning finally arrived, the deep psychological toll of playing the clueless dying victim was already beginning to wear heavily on my bones. I had exactly 2 short days left until my Tuesday deadline. I walked slowly down the curved oak staircase, purposely gripping the wooden handrail tightly to fake my supposed physical weakness. Diane was already bustling around the bright kitchen. She had prepared a warm bowl of oatmeal with fresh blueberries resting perfectly on a woven placemat next to a tall glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. And right beside the glass, resting inside a small, delicate porcelain dish, were 3 large, thick capsules. 2 of the pills were a dull, chalky white, and the third was a dark, muddy green. My eyes locked onto them immediately, and a sudden, violent wave of nausea rolled through my stomach. For the past 4 months, Diane had been religiously handing me these exact same pills every single morning. She told me they were a highly expensive imported herbal supplement, a special brain-boosting vitamin complex she had meticulously researched to help combat my supposed cognitive decline and memory loss. Before the horrifying events in the security room, I had swallowed them every single morning without a second thought, deeply grateful for a wife who cared so passionately about my health. But standing there now, staring down at those innocent-looking capsules, my survival instincts flared with blinding intensity. My gut was screaming at me. A cold, prickling sweat broke out across the back of my neck. If she was secretly planning to have me permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward by Tuesday, and if she had already paid off a corrupt medical doctor to legally declare me mentally incompetent, then what exactly had I been blindly swallowing every morning for the last 120 days? I remembered the sudden crushing waves of extreme fatigue that would hit me right around noon. The thick, heavy brain fog that made it nearly impossible to focus on simple construction blueprints at my desk. The slight, embarrassing slurring of my words that had started happening randomly during our weekend dinners at the country club. I had blamed all of those terrifying symptoms on the natural process of aging and decades of severe overwork. Now the dark, horrifying reality stared me directly in the face. She was not just faking my mental decline to our friends and family. She was actively, chemically inducing it. Diane turned around from the stove, wiping her clean hands on a floral apron, and smiled warmly at me. "Eat up, sweetheart," she coaxed gently, her voice smooth like honey. "And please do not forget to take your vitamins. You know how foggy and confused you get when you accidentally skip a dose." I forced my large hands to tremble slightly as I reached out for the small porcelain dish. I scooped the 3 heavy capsules into my rough palm, feeling their smooth, artificial coating against my skin. I looked her dead in the eye. I offered her a weak, deeply appreciative nod. "Thank you for taking such incredibly good care of me," I mumbled softly. I tossed the pills into my mouth quickly and smoothly, pushing them deep under my tongue. I immediately grabbed the heavy ceramic mug of black coffee and took a large, deliberate gulp, tilting my head back and swallowing loudly for effect. Diane watched me intently, her dark brown eyes carefully tracking the movement of my throat to ensure the job was done. "Good boy," she whispered affectionately, stepping forward to pat my shoulder before turning her back to begin loading the dishwasher. The deeply bitter, highly acidic chemical taste of the partially dissolving capsules immediately flooded my mouth, violently burning the sensitive skin directly under my tongue. I stood up slowly from the kitchen stool, intentionally letting my shoulders slump forward to look weak. I muttered something barely coherent about needing to use the downstairs restroom, and I slowly shuffled out of the kitchen, leaning heavily against the hallway wall as I walked. I reached the small powder room and quickly slipped inside. I locked the heavy brass door behind me. I grabbed a thick white linen hand towel from the rack, leaned over the cold marble sink, and spat the partially dissolved pills along with a mouthful of dark coffee into the fabric. I quickly turned on the heavy brass faucet and rinsed my burning mouth with freezing cold water, watching the milky white and green residue swirl rapidly down the shiny drain. Then I slowly raised my heavy head and stared directly at my own reflection in the spotless mirror. Deep, dark purple bags hung heavily under my severely bloodshot eyes. The man staring back at me looked completely broken, entirely exhausted, and incredibly old. But as the freezing water dripped slowly from my square chin, a new razor-sharp clarity began to pierce through the lingering chemical fog in my mind. For the first time in 4 agonizing months, my brain felt truly awake. The heavy fog was permanently lifting, revealing the cold, hard, undisputed truth. I was entirely on my own in this house. No one in my family was coming to save me now. If I wanted to survive Tuesday, I had to become just as ruthless and calculating as the woman who was trying to bury me. I wiped my face with the thick linen towel, making certain that not a single trace of the bitter chemical residue remained on my lips. I took one last long look in the polished mirror above the sink. The frail, confused, and utterly pathetic old man my wife and son desperately wanted me to be was officially dead. I unlocked the heavy brass door and stepped quietly back out into the bright hallway. I deliberately forced my broad shoulders to slump forward once again, carefully reassembling the physical disguise keeping me alive in this house. As I shuffled slowly toward the expansive living room, the sharp, sudden ringing of the landline phone echoed loudly through the quiet rooms. Diane was upstairs running the heavy vacuum cleaner, completely oblivious to the drastic change in my mental clarity. I reached the mahogany side table and picked up the heavy cordless receiver. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice raspy and intentionally weak. "Hey, Dad. It is me." The sharp voice on the other end of the line belonged to my only son, Bradley. But it did not sound anything like the sweet boy I had lovingly raised. It did not sound like the tearful, deeply grateful young man who had hugged me so tightly at his lavish wedding reception just a few short days ago. The voice transmitting through the small digital speaker was entirely devoid of any human warmth. It was cold, sharp, and terribly impatient. It was the harsh voice of a ruthless corporate dictator barking urgent orders at a low-level employee. There was no casual friendly greeting. There was no polite asking how I was feeling after the wedding festivities. "Look, I am incredibly busy down here at the main office today, so I am going to make this fast," Bradley continued, his tone dripping with an arrogant authority that made my blood run instantly cold. "I just called to firmly remind you about the critical appointment next week. You and Mom need to be ready to leave the house by 9 o'clock sharp." I furrowed my brow, leaning heavily against the painted drywall to steady myself, even though my awakened mind was now racing with terrifying clarity. "What appointment, Bradley?" I asked quietly, injecting just the right amount of pathetic elderly confusion into my raspy voice. My son let out a loud, highly exaggerated sigh of deep frustration. It was the exact same disrespectful sound he used to make when he was a spoiled teenager, complaining about his weekend chores. "God, Dad, your memory is getting significantly worse by the hour. We talked about this extensively last month. You have your mandatory comprehensive health evaluation scheduled for next Tuesday morning. Dr. Evans is going to run a full battery of advanced neurological tests to figure out exactly what is going wrong inside your failing head. We simply cannot keep pushing this off any longer. Your erratic behavior is becoming a serious liability." That single word struck me like a violent physical blow to the center of my chest. Liability. I was not a beloved father to him anymore. I was not the fiercely dedicated man who had bled and suffered for 40 brutal years to build the massive construction empire he was currently sitting in. I was simply a burdensome obstacle, a stubborn, expiring liability standing directly in the way of his multi-million-dollar inheritance. I gripped the plastic phone receiver so tightly, I genuinely thought the casing might crack in half. Tuesday. He had just confirmed the exact day they were planning to execute their elaborate trap. The terrifying timeline Diane had cheerfully mentioned on that hidden restaurant security footage was now locked firmly into place. I swallowed the rising, bitter bile in my throat and forced myself to sound incredibly meek. "Okay, Bradley. Tuesday at 9. I will write it down on the kitchen calendar so I do not forget." "You do not need to write anything down, Dad." Bradley snapped back quickly, his voice laced with venomous condescension. "Mom already has all the required legal paperwork and the schedule organized. Just do exactly what she tells you to do, and make sure you keep taking those special vitamins she bought you. The doctor said it is absolutely crucial that you build up a steady chemical baseline in your nervous system before the formal evaluation begins. Do you clearly understand me? You need to swallow those pills every single day. The sheer audacity of his cruel words sent a violent tremor of pure rage through my entire physical body. My own flesh and blood was aggressively ordering me to continue poisoning myself so that his corrupt, highly paid-off doctor would have the perfect, heavily drugged victim to medically evaluate. They had planned this monstrous betrayal meticulously. They were counting heavily on my absolute blind trust in their love. I understand, son, I whispered into the phone intentionally, letting my voice crack slightly for added dramatic effect. I am taking them. I took them just this morning. Good, Bradley replied coldly, completely unbothered by the pathetic, broken sound of his aging father's voice. I have a major board meeting starting in 5 minutes. Let Mom handle everything else. I will see you on Tuesday. He did not say goodbye. He did not say he loved me. The connection simply went dead, leaving me standing completely alone in the quiet hallway, listening to the hollow, mocking dial tone. I slowly lowered the phone back onto its charging base. I stared at the kitchen calendar. Tuesday. I had exactly 4 days left to save my own life. 96 hours before my own family dragged me into an examination room, presented fraudulent documents, and stripped me of my fundamental human rights. If I failed, I would be permanently locked in a psychiatric facility. I needed undeniable proof. I grabbed my heavy truck keys off the marble counter and quietly slipped out the heavy back door completely unnoticed. The heavy metal hinges of the back door barely made a sound as I pulled it shut behind me. I stepped out into the crisp autumn air, my boots crunching softly against the gravel driveway. I climbed into the cab of my truck, keeping the headlights completely off until I was halfway down the winding suburban street. I could not risk Diane looking out the upstairs window and seeing me leave. My heart was pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I steered onto the main highway heading toward the city. The road I took naturally led me right past the towering glass and steel headquarters of Sullivan Construction. The very building I had erected with my own 2 hands. As the massive structure loomed into view on my right, my knuckles turned white against the leather steering wheel. I saw Bradley's sleek black sports car parked in the reserved executive space directly out front. The space that used to have my name painted on the concrete. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road ahead, driving right past the empire I built, knowing the man sitting inside the top-floor corner office was currently plotting to destroy my life. I drove deep into the industrial district of the city, far away from the polished medical clinics of our affluent suburb. I needed a place that asked no questions and left absolutely no digital paper trail for Diane or Bradley to find. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of an independent private toxicology laboratory. The building was an unassuming gray cinder block structure with barred windows and a heavy security door. I turned off the engine, reached into the pocket of my flannel jacket, and pulled out the crumpled white napkin containing the partially dissolved pills from breakfast. I carefully wrapped it inside a small plastic sandwich bag I had grabbed from the kitchen. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I stepped out of the truck and walked inside. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low, annoying hum. I approached the thick glass partition and slid the plastic bag through the small metal slot to the technician sitting on the other side. I told him I needed a full, expedited chemical breakdown of the substances inside those capsules. When he asked for my insurance card and personal information, I simply pulled out my leather wallet and laid 8 crisp $100 bills directly onto the steel counter. I gave him a fake name and told him I would wait in the lobby for the rush results. The waiting room was intensely sterile and suffocatingly quiet. The walls were painted a pale, sickly green, and the air smelled heavily of industrial bleach and stale coffee. I slowly lowered myself into a hard plastic chair in the corner of the room, folding my large hands together in my lap. The loud ticking of the cheap plastic wall clock echoed through the empty space each second, sounding like a heavy hammer striking an iron anvil. That fatal Tuesday was coming. The deadline was rapidly approaching. I stared blankly down at the scuffed linoleum floor, desperately trying to keep my breathing calm and even. But in the deafening silence of that sterile room, the heavy floodgates of my memories violently burst open. The sheer magnitude of my son's betrayal crashed over me, suffocating me with the agonizing weight of the past. I closed my eyes, and suddenly, I was not a 70-year-old man fighting for his freedom. I was 35 again, standing on the bright green grass of our old neighborhood park. I could vividly see little Bradley, barely 6 years old, sitting nervously on his shiny blue bicycle with the training wheels freshly taken off. He was terrified of falling. I remembered running alongside him, my hand firmly gripping the back of his small seat, promising him over and over again that his father would never let him crash. When I finally let go, he pedaled furiously, a massive smile of pure joy lighting up his chubby face. When he eventually lost his balance and scraped his knee on the concrete pavement, was the one who scooped him up into my arms. I wiped his hot tears, kissed his forehead, and told him that as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would always be there to protect him from the harshness of the world. I gave him everything a father could possibly give. I gave him my entire youth, my strength, and my unconditional, unwavering love. The memory shifted painfully to just 3 years ago, the day I officially retired. We were standing together in the center of the massive executive corner office overlooking the city skyline. I remembered the immense pride swelling in my chest as I took the heavy brass keys to the building off my own keyring and placed them directly into Bradley's open palm. I looked him in the eye and told him how incredibly proud I was of the man he had become. I told him that the company was his, now a lasting legacy, to carry our family name into the future. I had genuinely believed I was securing a beautiful, prosperous future for both of us. I thought I had built a fortress of security. But sitting in that cold, sterile laboratory waiting room, the devastating truth finally settled deep into my bones. I did not build a legacy. I built a weapon. And my own son had picked up that exact weapon, loaded it with my money, and was now aiming it directly at my head. The little boy I taught to ride a bike was gone. The grown man who eagerly took those heavy office keys from my old hands was a cold, calculating monster. I opened my eyes, the sorrow in my deeply broken heart, completely burning away forever, leaving behind nothing but a cold, absolute, and unforgiving resolve to survive. The harsh fluorescent light above my head buzzed incessantly, drilling into my thoughts as I sat in that rigid plastic chair. I must have stared at the scuffed linoleum floor for over 2 hours. Finally, the heavy steel door behind the thick glass partition clicked open. The lab technician stepped back into the small front office, holding a few sheets of white paper attached to a clipboard. He looked down at the paperwork, his brow furrowed in deep concentration, before stepping up to the small metal speaker box. He called out the fake name I had given him earlier. I slowly stood up from my chair, my joints stiff from the tense waiting, and walked over to the glass counter. The technician did not slide the papers through the metal slot right away. Instead, he looked up at me with an expression of genuine, profound concern etched across his face. He leaned closer to the glass and lowered his voice, speaking in a very serious, hushed tone. He asked me if the person taking these capsules was currently under the direct supervision of a licensed medical professional. I stared back at him, keeping my face completely blank, and simply told him to read me the results of the chemical analysis. The technician let out a heavy sigh and looked back down at his clipboard. He explained that the capsules I brought in were completely devoid of any natural vitamins, minerals, or herbal supplements. They were completely counterfeit shells. Inside those shells was a highly dangerous, carefully measured pharmaceutical cocktail. He pointed to the first line on his report. He told me the primary ingredient was a massive dose of a powerful central nervous system depressant. It was a heavy sedative typically used in psychiatric wards to completely subdue violent or deeply psychotic patients. Then he pointed to the second compound. This one was even more terrifying. He described it as a strong cognitive inhibitor, a specific class of chemical designed to aggressively block the neurotransmitters in the brain responsible for memory formation, spatial awareness, and basic logical reasoning. He looked me dead in the eyes and said that if an elderly person ingested this precise combination on a daily basis, within a few weeks, they would begin exhibiting the exact undeniable clinical symptoms of late-stage dementia. They would lose their balance. They would slur their speech. They would suffer from severe, terrifying memory blackouts. And eventually, their respiratory system would simply shut down. The technician slid the printed toxicology report through the small metal slot. He strongly advised me to contact the local authorities immediately, warning that this combination of drugs was essentially a slow, untraceable poison. I took the papers, folded them carefully, and slid them into the inner pocket of my heavy flannel jacket. I thanked him for his time, turned around, and walked out of the clinic. The cold autumn air hit my face as I stepped back into the desolate parking lot, but I barely felt it. My mind was completely consumed by the sheer, unadulterated evil of what Diane had been doing. My wife of 35 years had not just been gaslighting me with misplaced keys and changed passwords. She had been systematically chemically poisoning my brain. Every single morning, she had stood in our beautiful kitchen wearing her floral apron, smiling warmly as she handed me a loaded weapon wrapped in a porcelain dish. She watched me swallow it, kissing my cheek while knowing she was literally rotting my mind from the inside out. She was meticulously preparing the perfect drugged victim for her corrupt doctor to evaluate on Tuesday morning. I realized then that my sudden bouts of extreme exhaustion, the terrifying moments when I could not remember the names of my own employees, all of it was artificially manufactured by the woman sleeping beside me. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my truck and locked the doors. I pulled the folded toxicology report out of my pocket and stared at the dark ink on the white paper. This was no longer just a horrifying suspicion based on a grainy video. This was undeniable medical proof of a calculated conspiracy to commit severe bodily harm and fraud. It was the first piece of tangible ammunition in my arsenal. But I also knew it was not nearly enough to destroy them. If I simply went to the police right now, Diane and Bradley would hire the most expensive lawyers in the state. They would claim I fabricated the evidence that I was an old man having a delusional breakdown. I needed far more than a single report. I needed to uncover the scope of their financial operation. I needed to know where my money was secretly going and who else was involved in this elaborate trap. I could not fight this battle using expected routes. I needed someone operating entirely in the unseen shadows, someone who did not play by the polite rules of high society. I reached into the deep glove compartment of my heavy truck and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. I flipped through the old yellowed pages until I found a very specific phone number written in faded blue ink. It was the private number for a man I had not spoken to in nearly a decade, a man who specialized in digging up the darkest, most heavily guarded secrets that wealthy people desperately tried to hide from the world. I pulled out the cheap prepaid burner phone I had purchased earlier that morning at a random isolated gas station on the edge of town. I carefully dialed the long sequence of numbers, listening to the hollow ringing echo through the quiet cab of my truck. I was no longer blindly playing the pathetic role of the confused, declining victim waiting to be slaughtered. I was officially going on the offensive, and I was going to burn their entire criminal operation to the absolute ground. The line clicked on the fourth ring. A deep, gravelly voice answered without offering a name. "Yeah, speak." It was Harrison. We first crossed paths nearly 15 years ago during a massive commercial warehouse build down by the shipping ports. Someone was systematically stealing heavy copper wiring from my job site in the dead of night, costing me tens of thousands of dollars. The local police were useless, bogged down in bureaucracy. So a union buddy gave me Harrison's number. He was a former military intelligence officer who had transitioned into private investigative work. He did not wear a suit, he did not work out of a fancy downtown office, and he certainly did not care about playing by the rules. Within 3 days, he found the thieves, recovered the stolen materials, and handled the situation with a quiet, terrifying efficiency that I never questioned. I cleared my throat, gripping the cheap plastic burner phone tightly. "Harrison, it is Rick Sullivan," I said, my voice steady and low. "I need your particular set of skills again. It is highly urgent and it involves my own family. I need to see you right now." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. The heavy silence spoke volumes. Harrison did not ask for details over an unsecured connection. He simply gave me an address for a rusted-out 24-hour diner, situated on a desolate stretch of highway just past the county line, and then he abruptly hung up. I put the truck in gear and drove out into the fading afternoon light. The diner was exactly the kind of place you went when you did not want to be seen. The neon sign hanging above the door was half burnt out, buzzing loudly against the brick facade. The parking lot was mostly empty, dotted with a few beat-up sedans and long-haul transport trucks. I parked my heavy truck near the back edge of the lot, pulling my flannel jacket tight against the bitter autumn wind as I stepped out into the cold. When I walked through the double glass doors, the smell of burnt coffee and stale cigarette smoke hit me instantly. I scanned the dim, narrow room. Harrison was sitting in a corner booth facing the entrance, his back pressed firmly against the peeling vinyl wall. He looked exactly the same as he did 15 years ago. He had sharp, assessing eyes, a closely cropped military haircut, and a worn leather jacket over a plain dark shirt. He was quietly sipping a mug of black coffee, watching my every move as I approached his table. I slid into the booth opposite him, keeping my hands resting flat on the sticky Formica tabletop. He looked at the deep, dark bags under my eyes and the rigid tension in my jaw. "You look like a man who is currently standing on the edge of a very steep cliff, Rick," Harrison said quietly, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I am not just standing on the edge, Harrison," I replied, my tone entirely devoid of any emotion. "I am being actively pushed. And the people doing the pushing are my wife and my son." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was $10,000 in untraceable cash, completely withdrawn from a secure secondary emergency safety deposit box I had secretly maintained for decades. I slid the heavy envelope across the table. Harrison did not touch it immediately. He just kept his piercing eyes locked directly onto mine, waiting for the rest of the story. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so the lone waitress wiping down the far counter could not hear a single syllable. "They are planning to have me permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward this coming Tuesday," I explained coldly. "My wife has been secretly poisoning me for months, with a heavy cocktail of sedatives and cognitive inhibitors to artificially mimic the advanced stages of dementia. She has a corrupt medical doctor already paid off to sign the official incompetency papers. My son, the boy I handed my entire construction empire to, is fully involved in the conspiracy. They are planning to legally freeze my $8 million estate, lock me away in a sterile white room until I eventually die, and completely split the assets between them. I even have a copy of the toxicology report from an independent laboratory proving the chemical poisoning." Harrison finally reached out and pulled the thick envelope of cash across the table, slipping it smoothly into his leather jacket. His expression did not change, but I could see a cold, dangerous light ignite behind his eyes. "What exactly do you need me to do?" he asked. "I need you to be a ghost," I answered firmly. "I need absolute, around-the-clock surveillance on 3 specific targets: my wife Diane, my son Bradley, and his brand-new wife Megan. They just got married on Saturday, and she is right in the middle of this nightmare. I need to know absolutely everything. I need to know exactly who they are meeting, where they are going, and what they are doing when they think nobody is watching them. Follow the money flowing out of my company. Find the corrupt doctor they paid off. find every single crack in their flawless armor. Because when Tuesday morning finally arrives, I am not just going to defend myself. I am going to utterly annihilate them. Harrison took a slow sip of his black coffee. He set the heavy ceramic mug down and gave me a single sharp nod. Consider them exposed, Rick. They will not be able to buy a cup of coffee without me documenting every detail. I will send all updates directly to your burner phone. Keep playing the confused old man. Let them think they have won. He stood up and walked silently out the back exit into the shadows. I watched the door swing shut behind Harrison, leaving me alone in the dim room. My physical surveillance was secured, but a darker, more complex battle was looming ahead. If Diane and Bradley were planning to seize my estate by Tuesday morning, they needed an airtight legal foundation. For 20 years, Arthur had been my trusted family attorney. He drafted my will-handled incorporation papers for my company and ate Thanksgiving dinner at my table. But Arthur was also deeply intertwined with the daily operations of my business, taking direct orders from my son. I could not risk going to him. If Arthur was part of their conspiracy, walking into his office would instantly trigger the trap. I needed someone outside my personal circle. I needed a shark. I needed Mitchell. I met Mitchell a decade ago during a contentious land dispute with a rival developer. Mitchell was opposing counsel. He was a deeply cynical, ruthless corporate litigation lawyer who treated the courtroom like a gladiator arena. He had absolutely no moral compass when it came to destroying his opponents, utilizing every hidden loophole available to crush them financially. Back then, I despised his methods. But today, his ruthlessness was exactly what I needed to survive. I walked to my truck, pulled out the burner phone, and called his office. I told his secretary I was willing to pay triple his hourly rate for an immediate off-the-books consultation. Within 45 minutes, I was pulling into the underground garage of his downtown high-rise. I took the private elevator up to the top floor. The heavy glass doors opened into a sprawling office featuring imported marble floors and tall windows overlooking the gray city skyline. Mitchell sat behind a massive glass desk wearing a sharply tailored suit that probably cost more than my first truck. He did not smile when I walked in. He simply gestured toward the leather chair opposite him. We skipped the pleasantries. I sat down and laid out the terrifying facts of my situation. I told him about the hidden security footage from the wedding reception. I told him about the counterfeit vitamins Diane was feeding me, deliberately inducing chemical dementia to ensure I failed the upcoming medical evaluation. I handed him the toxicology report from the independent laboratory to prove I was not a paranoid old man losing his grip on reality. Mitchell took the papers, his calculating eyes scanning the chemical breakdown without a single trace of emotion on his face. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair and tapped his silver pen against the desk. He told me that if my family was truly preparing for a Tuesday execution, the legal framework would already have to be moving silently through the court system. He swiveled his chair around to face his multiple computer monitors and began rapidly typing. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he bypassed standard public records, digging deep into the secure financial databases and sealed judicial filings that only top-tier litigators knew how to access. The silence in the office was deafening. I sat completely still, listening to the rhythmic clicking of his keys, feeling a cold knot of dread forming at the bottom of my stomach. After 10 agonizing minutes, Mitchell suddenly stopped typing. He let out a low, cynical whistle. He turned his chair back around to face me, pushing his laptop screen forward so I could see the complex legal documents displayed on the monitor. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that my instincts were entirely correct. My longtime family lawyer, Arthur, was not just involved in the conspiracy. He was the primary architect of the entire legal trap. Mitchell pointed a steady finger at a specific digital document on the screen. He explained that Bradley and Arthur had secretly filed a sealed preliminary injunction against my entire estate just 3 days ago. It was a highly aggressive, specialized legal maneuver known as a shadow lock. Based on a medical affidavit signed by their bribed doctor, they convinced a sympathetic judge that I was in immediate financial danger to myself and my company. The shadow lock meant that while my bank accounts and investment portfolios appeared perfectly normal on the surface, I was actually entirely locked out. If I tried to move a single dollar, sell a single share of stock, or alter my company ownership structure, the transaction would be instantly blocked and flagged by the court. They had completely severed my financial arteries without me ever feeling the blade. Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass desk. The chilling reality of my situation hung heavily in the air between us. He explained that Tuesday was not just a simple medical evaluation. It was the final, fatal blow. Once the corrupt doctor officially signed the final incompetency papers on Tuesday morning, the shadow lock would automatically convert into a permanent conservatorship. Bradley would become my absolute legal guardian. My son would have total, undisputed control over my $8 million empire, my physical body, and my fundamental human rights. Mitchell looked at me with a grim, solemn expression. He said that if Tuesday happened according to their schedule, Rick Sullivan would be legally erased from existence. I would become a complete ghost in the eyes of the law, trapped inside a psychiatric ward, with no money, no voice, and absolutely no way to ever fight back. I sat back in the leather chair, absorbing the devastating magnitude of their calculated cruelty. Looking at the cold, predatory gleam in Mitchell's eyes, I knew I had finally found the perfect weapon to break it. I tossed another thick stack of $100 bills onto his desk. I told him to draft the counteroffensive. I was not going to let my own son bury me alive. We would quietly dismantle their entire legal framework piece by piece, preparing for a massive war they never saw coming. I left the towering glass building and stepped back into the freezing afternoon air. The drive back to my sprawling suburban estate was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I needed complete and absolute focus. I had just declared a quiet, invisible war against my own flesh and blood, and the battlefield was going to be my own dining room. I pulled my heavy truck into the winding driveway, parked it carefully inside the massive garage, and sat in the driver's seat for a few long, steadying moments. I closed my eyes and actively forced my heart rate to slow down. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward. I loosened my jaw and let a dull, vacant glaze wash over my eyes. I was no longer Rick Sullivan, the ruthless self-made construction magnate who just hired a corporate shark to dismantle his family. I was Rick Sullivan, the pathetic, deteriorating old man whose mind was slowly melting away. I unlocked the heavy back door and shuffled slowly into the bright, warm kitchen. The rich smell of roasted chicken and vegetable soup filled the air. Diane was standing by the stove stirring a large silver pot, and sitting at the marble kitchen island, typing rapidly on his expensive smartphone, was Bradley. He had apparently decided to drop by for dinner, likely to check on the progress of his father's carefully induced chemical dementia. I let out a long, raspy breath and dragged my heavy boots across the polished hardwood floor, making sure my footsteps sounded clumsy and uncoordinated. Diane turned around, her face instantly melting into that perfectly manufactured mask of sweet, patronizing concern. "There you are, sweetheart," she cooed, wiping her hands on a towel. "We were starting to worry. Where have you been all afternoon?" I blinked slowly, looking around the kitchen, as if I did not quite recognize my own appliances. "I just went for a short drive," I mumbled, intentionally slurring my words slightly. "I think I got a little turned around near the old highway." Bradley stopped typing on his phone and looked up at me. His eyes were cold, hard, and filled with an undeniable, piercing disgust. He let out a sharp sigh and shook his head, leaning back in his tall chair. "You got lost driving in broad daylight, Dad?" Bradley asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have lived in this exact same neighborhood for over 20 years. How do you get lost on the old highway?" Diane rushed over and placed a gentle guiding hand on my lower back, steering me toward one of the heavy dining chairs. Now, Bradley, do not snap at your father, she scolded lightly, though I could clearly hear the faint, sickening tremor of pure triumph vibrating in her sweet voice. The medicine makes him very foggy in the late afternoon. Here, Rick, sit down and eat some hot soup. It will make you feel so much better. I lowered myself heavily into the wooden chair, letting my hand tremble violently as I rested them on the smooth tabletop. Diane placed a deep ceramic bowl of steaming vegetable soup directly in front of me, along with a heavy silver spoon. I stared down at the hot broth. This was the moment. I had to swallow every single ounce of my pride and give them the exact tragic performance they were eagerly waiting to see. I reached out with my right hand, making sure my fingers shook uncontrollably. I gripped the smooth handle of the silver spoon, scooped up a large portion of the hot liquid, and began bringing it toward my mouth. Halfway up, I deliberately jerked my wrist. The heavy spoon tilted sharply, and the scalding hot soup splashed aggressively down the front of my clean flannel shirt and pooled across the polished mahogany table. I let out a loud, pathetic gasp, dropping the spoon with a sharp clatter. "Oh, I am so sorry," I stammered weakly, staring at the mess with wide, frightened eyes. "I do not know what happened. My hand just slipped." "I am so sorry, Diane." The reaction was instantaneous. Bradley threw his hands up in the air, pushing his chair back violently so the hot liquid would not drip onto his custom-tailored suit pants. "Jesus Christ, Dad. Look what you just did," he snapped loudly, completely abandoning any pretense of familial respect. "You are making a massive mess everywhere. You eat like a literal toddler now." I kept my head bowed in deep shame, but from the corner of my eye I watched their faces. I watched the micro-expressions flash across their features. Bradley was not just annoyed. He was thrilled. He was looking at a broken man who could never legally challenge his authority in a boardroom. And Diane, as she rushed over with a handful of paper towels, was biting the inside of her cheek to hide a massive, victorious smile. "Oh, Rick, it is okay. It is just a little spill," she murmured soothingly, dabbing aggressively at my ruined shirt. But beneath her sweet words, her eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of human empathy. The psychological torture of sitting in my own home listening to my own son speak to me like a stray dog was almost unbearable. I remembered sitting at this very same table 20 years ago, patiently holding a small plastic spoon, teaching Bradley how to eat without spilling. I had wiped his chin when he made a mess. Now he was looking at me with absolute, unfiltered hatred. Diane gently pulled me up from the chair, treating me like a fragile, incompetent child. "Let us get you cleaned up and put you straight to bed, Rick," she whispered, leading me out of the warm kitchen and toward the dark hallway. "You are just completely exhausted." I nodded dumbly, letting her slowly guide me away. I played my pathetic role perfectly tonight. They had absolutely no idea. I lay perfectly still in the dark, staring up at the ceiling of my bedroom. The heavy oak door was firmly shut, and I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of Diane humming cheerfully downstairs as she loaded the dishwasher. She had tucked me in like a sickly child, pulling the heavy comforter up to my chin and gently kissing my forehead before turning out the lights. The sickening contrast between her gentle, loving touch and the monstrous reality of her betrayal made my skin crawl. I waited for over an hour, listening to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, making absolutely sure the house was completely settled for the night. Only when I heard the heavy footsteps of my son walking out the front door and the distant roar of his sports car engine fading down the street did I finally allow myself to move. I slowly pushed the heavy blankets aside and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. I reached deep under the thick mattress pad right near the wooden bed frame and pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone I had hidden there earlier that afternoon. The screen was completely dark, but the small notification light at the top was blinking with a steady, urgent red pulse. Harrison had found something. I unlocked the small device shielding the bright glare of the screen with my large hands so the light would not reflect off the bedroom windows. There was a single encrypted text message from Harrison containing a secure digital link. I clicked on it, and a heavy digital file began to download. My heart hammered against my ribs as a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs suddenly populated the small screen. The timestamps on the images indicated they had been taken just a few hours ago, right in the middle of the afternoon, while I was sitting in Mitchell's office planning my legal counterattack. Harrison had been tracking Megan. Megan, the sweet, soft-spoken girl my son had just married on Saturday. I stared at the first few photos, trying to process the glaring inconsistencies staring back at me. Bradley had introduced Megan to the family roughly a year ago. She played the part of a struggling, humble graduate student who grew up in severe poverty in a rural farming town. She wore modest, inexpensive clothes, drove a beat-up 10-year-old sedan, and always spoke with wide, grateful eyes whenever Diane or I offered to pay for a family dinner. I had genuinely liked her. I had admired her supposed work ethic, remembering my own desperate struggles as a young man trying to build a life from the dirt up. When Bradley told me he was renting a modest, sensible apartment for the two of them on the outskirts of the city to save money for their future, I had been incredibly proud of his financial maturity. That was exactly why I had written them that massive $500,000 wedding check. I wanted to reward their humility and give them the comfortable head start I never had. But the woman in these surveillance photographs was not a humble, struggling student. The first image showed Megan walking out of an upscale boutique in the city's most expensive shopping district. She was not wearing the simple, thrifted sweaters she wore around our house. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored, high-end designer pantsuit, carrying a leather handbag that cost more than most people made in a month. Her posture was not shy or deferential. She walked with the sharp, confident stride of a woman who owned the world. I swiped to the next photograph, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. Megan was not walking toward the rusty 10-year-old sedan she always parked in our driveway during family dinners. She was pressing a sleek digital key fob, unlocking the doors of a brand-new custom black Porsche Panamera. I zoomed in on the image, my eyes scanning the gleaming paint and the temporary dealer plates. This was a car that easily cost well over $150,000. The sweet poor girl who had cried tears of gratitude when I bought her a simple gold necklace for her birthday was casually sliding into the driver's seat of a luxury sports car. Harrison had followed her as she drove away from the shopping district. I swiped through the sequential photos, watching the black Porsche navigate through the heavy city traffic. She was not heading toward the modest, sensible apartment complex Bradley had supposedly rented for them on the outskirts of town. She was driving directly into the financial center of the city, pulling up to the valet stand of a towering ultra-luxury residential high-rise. This was a building I knew very well. I had bid on the concrete contract for its massive foundation just 5 years ago. It was a high-security fortress designed specifically for the city's billionaires, professional athletes, and elite corporate executives. The penthouse suites in that building sold for upwards of $3 million. I stared at the final photograph in the encrypted file. It showed Megan handing the keys of her new Porsche to the uniformed valet, casually tossing him a large cash tip before strolling through the heavy glass doors of the grand lobby. The doorman greeted her with a familiar, respectful nod, indicating she was not just a guest. She was a recognized permanent resident. I lowered the small plastic phone to my lap, the cold, heavy realization sinking deep into my tired bones. The wedding was a complete and utter fraud. Megan was not a naive, innocent girl who had accidentally married into a corrupt family. She was a highly paid professional imposter, a crucial active participant in the elaborate trap designed to steal my entire life's work. The dark conspiracy was growing rapidly, branching out into a heavily funded criminal operation. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, the glowing screen of the burner phone illuminating my trembling hands. The sheer scale of the deception was suddenly expanding far beyond the walls of my own home, Just as my racing mind tried to comprehend how my son had managed to orchestrate and fund such an elaborate illusion, the small device in my palm violently vibrated. An incoming call from Harrison flashed across the dark screen. I quickly pressed the answer button and brought the plastic receiver to my ear, keeping my breathing as silent as possible. I did not say a single word. I just waited for the private investigator to speak. Harrison let out a low, rough exhale through his nose. His voice was completely devoid of its usual calm detachment. It was tight-laced with a rare sense of genuine disbelief. He told me he had just finished pulling the municipal property records for that ultra-luxury downtown high-rise. I braced myself, expecting him to confirm that my son had secretly drained my corporate accounts to buy the $3 million penthouse for his fake bride. But what Harrison said next struck me with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The property did not belong to Bradley. It was completely registered and paid off in full cash by a man named Gregory Mitchell. My heart physically skipped a beat, a cold, sickening wave of pure shock crashing through my chest. Gregory. Greg. My trusted company accountant, my closest confidant, and supposedly my dearest friend for the past 30 years. He was the man who sat across from my desk every single afternoon, sharing a cup of dark roast coffee while we meticulously reviewed the quarterly ledgers. He was the man who had celebrated every major milestone of my life, crying tears of joy when my company hit its first $1 million in revenue. Just 4 days ago, Greg had stood at the altar in his tailored suit, proudly acting as the ordained officiant for Bradley and Megan's wedding. He had smiled warmly at me, his eyes crinkling with supposed affection, as he pronounced my son and that woman husband and wife. The horrific realization hit me so hard, I had to press my free hand against my chest to remember how to breathe. Greg was not just a passive bystander. He was the invisible hand moving the pieces across the chessboard. Harrison continued speaking, his gravelly voice cutting through my internal panic. He explained that he had dug deeper into Megan's heavily fabricated background. She was never a struggling graduate student from a rural farming town. Her real name was Victoria, and she was an elite, highly exclusive luxury escort who catered strictly to corrupt politicians and wealthy corporate criminals. Harrison had managed to hack into the private financial routing numbers attached to the penthouse property. He tracked a massive web of untraceable shell companies that led directly back to Greg. For the past 12 months, Greg had been quietly wiring tens of thousands of dollars to an offshore account owned by Victoria. The entire relationship, the romantic dates, the tearful engagement, and the lavish wedding that I had personally financed, was nothing but an ironclad business contract. Greg had specifically hired a high-end escort to play the role of the perfect innocent bride. It was a calculated move to secure Bradley's public image, to give him an aura of humble stability, and to guarantee that I would eagerly open my checkbook to support them. Megan was just a well-paid actress performing on a stage that Greg had meticulously built. I sat in the pitch-black bedroom, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. It was not just my wife and my son. My oldest friend, the man who managed every single penny of my $8 million empire, was actively engineering my total destruction. He had access to all my private accounts, my corporate tax filings, and the very retirement funds Diane had lied about me signing over. The walls of my own life were closing in around me, revealing that everyone I had ever loved or trusted was holding a knife to my back. The suffocating darkness of the quiet bedroom felt far heavier than solid concrete. I closed my eyes, visualizing Greg smiling at the altar, Diane handing me the poisoned pills, and Bradley sneering at my wedding gift. The agonizing pain of their collective treason slowly crystallized into a weapon of pure, unbreakable resolve. I spoke into the phone, my voice dropping to a terrifying hollow whisper. I told Harrison that I needed absolute proof of Greg's corporate embezzlement. If Greg had enough liquid cash to casually purchase a $3 million penthouse and put a luxury escort on a massive monthly retainer, he had been systematically bleeding my construction company dry for a very long time. I instructed Harrison to immediately coordinate with Mitchell, my new corporate litigation attorney. I told him to authorize Mitchell to completely bypass the standard legal protocols and violently tear through the secure financial firewalls of my own business. I did not care if they had to employ illegal hackers or bribe bank managers. I needed the hidden ledgers, the offshore wire transfers, and the shadow accounts before Tuesday morning arrived. Harrison agreed without a single moment of hesitation, recognizing the absolute desperation and fury radiating from my voice. He promised he would deliver the financial autopsy by sunrise and abruptly ended the call. I lowered the burner phone carefully, sliding it back under the heavy mattress pad. I lay back against the soft pillows, staring blankly up at the ceiling. The enemy was not just inside my home anymore. The dangerous, greedy enemy had quietly infected every single important aspect of my long existence. But they had made one fatal mistake tonight in their grand design. They foolishly left me alive, and I was going to destroy them entirely. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy bedroom curtains, casting a cold, gray light across the hardwood floor. I had not slept a single second since my phone call with Harrison. I quietly dressed, maintaining the fragile illusion of the sick, exhausted old man. Diane was still asleep, her breathing slow and rhythmic. I slipped out of the house before dawn, driving my truck toward the downtown financial district. Mitchell had sent an encrypted text message telling me to get to his office immediately. The private elevator carried me to the top floor. When the heavy glass doors slid open, I found Mitchell sitting behind his massive desk, surrounded by empty coffee cups and thick stacks of printed financial ledgers. He looked tired, but his eyes gleamed with the predatory thrill of a hunter. "Rick, sit down," Mitchell said, his voice completely devoid of its usual cynical drawl. "I brought in a team of forensic accountants and a private cybersecurity contractor last night. We completely bypassed your company's internal firewall. Arthur and Greg built a highly sophisticated digital fortress, but they left a tiny back door open in the vendor payment portal. We spent the last 8 hours tearing through the shadow ledgers." I lowered myself into the leather chair, feeling the familiar weight of dread settling into my stomach. I asked how bad the financial damage was. Mitchell turned his laptop around and pushed it across the glass desk. The screen was filled with complex spreadsheets, highlighting hundreds of transactions marked in bright red ink. He leaned forward and delivered the devastating blow. "They have been bleeding you completely dry for the last 3 years, Rick. Bradley and Greg have systematically siphoned over $4 million out of your corporate operating accounts." I stared at the glowing screen, my mind struggling to process the staggering numbers. $4 million. That was half of the entire empire I had spent 40 grueling years building from the dirt up. Mitchell began to explain their highly calculated methodology. Greg, acting as your trusted chief accountant, had been creating dozens of fake invoices for phantom construction materials and ghost subcontractors. He would approve the massive payouts, and Bradley, acting as the newly appointed chief executive officer, would officially sign off on the wire transfers. The stolen money was laundered through offshore shell companies, registered in the Cayman Islands, before being deposited into hidden private trusts Arthur had quietly established. They had effectively hollowed out the entire financial foundation of Sullivan Construction. If the economy took a downturn, my company would instantly collapse under its hidden debt. The sheer scale of their corporate treason was absolutely breathtaking. I felt a violent surge of pure, unadulterated rage burn through my chest. My own flesh and blood had robbed me blind, using the very man I trusted to balance my books. But as I sat there, staring at the endless rows of red numbers, the blinding fog of anger began to slowly recede, replaced by a cold, sharp, and highly analytical clarity. My decades of experience running a cutthroat business kicked in. I looked at the offshore routing numbers, and a deeply unsettling question began to form in my mind. The mathematics of this criminal conspiracy simply did not make logical sense. I looked up from the computer screen and met Mitchell's intense gaze. I pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at the name Gregory Mitchell printed on the top of the forged invoices. "Why is Greg doing this?" I asked quietly, my voice echoing slightly in the large office. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, clearly confused by my sudden question. He said, "For the money, obviously. $4 million is a massive incentive for any corporate accountant." I slowly shook my head. "No, you do not understand the psychology of a man like Greg. I have known him for 30 years. He is a deeply cautious, highly risk-averse numbers guy. He checks every single receipt twice. Embezzling $4 million across international borders is a massive federal crime. It carries a mandatory sentence of decades in a maximum security prison. Why would a cautious employee risk spending the rest of his natural life behind bars just to help his boss's spoiled son get rich? Even if Bradley promised him a huge cut of the stolen money, the personal risk is entirely disproportionate to the reward. There is absolutely no honor among thieves, especially in corporate fraud." Mitchell frowned, leaning back in his chair as he processed my logic. I continued speaking, the sickening intuition growing stronger with every single word. "Greg is a smart man. He knows that if the federal authorities ever audited my company, Bradley would immediately throw him under the bus to save himself. Bradley would claim the accountant went rogue. Greg has to know that. Yet he is not just participating in this fraud. He is actively engineering it. He is funding the luxury penthouse. He hired the high-end escort to play the fake bride. He is heavily investing his own money and his own freedom into Bradley's ultimate success." Mitchell remained completely silent, the heavy implications of my words hanging in the cold air between us. "A man does not lay down his life, his career, and his freedom for someone else's child," I whispered, feeling a terrifying icy chill crawl slowly down my spine. "A man only takes those kinds of massive, catastrophic risks to protect his own blood." I looked back down at the spreadsheets, a horrifying new puzzle rapidly assembling itself in my mind. The timeline of their financial crimes. The absolute, unwavering loyalty Greg showed to my son. The way Diane had so seamlessly integrated Greg into every single aspect of our personal family life. I suddenly realized that the embezzlement was just a symptom of a much darker, much more intimate disease. I grabbed the edge of the glass desk, my knuckles turning completely white. I needed a biological answer to a financial question. I left Mitchell sitting in his lavish office, the glowing spreadsheets of my stolen wealth reflecting in his stunned eyes. As soon as the private elevator doors closed, I pulled out my secure burner phone and dialed Harrison. When the private investigator answered, his gruff voice immediately sensed the profound shift in my demeanor. I did not bother explaining the complex financial ledgers or the offshore shell companies. I gave him a single, highly specific and deeply unsettling directive. I told him I needed a clean, uncontaminated sample of my son's DNA by the end of the afternoon. Harrison did not ask a single question or express any hesitation. He simply grunted his affirmation and hung up the phone. I stepped out into the bustling city streets, the cold autumn wind whipping against my heavy jacket, feeling completely detached from the world around me. The terrifying theory forming in my mind was so utterly monstrous that I needed indisputable scientific proof before I could fully accept it. 2 hours later, Harrison texted me a brief update. He had successfully tailed Bradley from the corporate headquarters to our exclusive suburban country club. Bradley was having a leisurely outdoor lunch on the terrace, completely unaware that his entire life was about to unravel. Harrison seamlessly blended into the affluent environment, wearing a borrowed golf shirt and carrying a leather duffel bag. He sat at a table just a few yards away, patiently waiting for the perfect opportunity. According to Harrison's subsequent messages, Bradley finished his meal, ordered a dark roast espresso, and then abruptly received a phone call. Bradley stood up, pacing near the edge of the terrace while barking angry orders into his cell phone. In that brief 30-second window of distraction, Harrison smoothly walked past Bradley's table, swiped the small porcelain espresso cup with a gloved hand, and slipped it directly into a sterile plastic evidence bag hidden inside his duffel. By the time Bradley returned to his table, Harrison was already walking out the front gates of the club. We met in the empty parking lot of a desolate strip mall on the outskirts of the city. Harrison handed me the sealed plastic bag through the open window of my heavy truck. Inside, the small white espresso cup still bore the faint dark rim of Bradley's coffee. I thanked Harrison, handing him another thick roll of cash for his remarkable efficiency. I immediately drove to a highly discreet private genetics laboratory located in the neighboring county. I walked into the sterile reception area and placed the plastic bag on the counter, along with a freshly plucked hair from my own head. I paid a massive premium in cash, demanding their absolute fastest expedited paternity test. The laboratory director promised me the results would be securely emailed to my encrypted burner phone within 24 hours. I walked out of the clinic, my chest feeling incredibly hollow. I had set the final devastating wheels in motion. I drove back to my sprawling estate, arriving just before the late afternoon sun began to set. Diane was not home yet. Her expensive car was missing from the large garage. The massive house was completely silent, filled only with the heavy, suffocating weight of 3 decades of carefully orchestrated lies. I did not go to the kitchen to pretend to be the confused, sick old man. Instead, I walked slowly down the long hallway toward the large mahogany doors of my private study. I opened the bottom drawer of my heavy oak desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound family photo album. The binding cracked softly as I opened it to the very first page. I sat down in my leather armchair, resting the heavy album on my lap, and stared at the faded, glossy photographs staring back at me. The first picture was taken 30 years ago in the bright, sterile room of the local maternity ward. I was wearing a cheap, wrinkled flannel shirt, my face completely exhausted, but glowing with an indescribable, overwhelming joy. I was gently holding a tiny, red-faced infant, wrapped tightly in a thin hospital blanket. Diane was lying in the hospital bed behind me, smiling sweetly at the camera. I traced my rough, calloused finger over the image of that helpless baby. I remembered the fierce, protective love that had instantly exploded in my heart the very second the nurse placed Bradley into my clumsy arms. I had quietly promised that tiny boy that I would spend the rest of my natural life building a kingdom for him. I had willingly sacrificed my own physical health, working brutal double shifts in the freezing rain, just so he would never know the bitter taste of poverty. I slowly turned the heavy pages, watching my son grow up through the frozen flashes of time. There was Bradley taking his first awkward steps on the plush living room carpet. There was Bradley proudly holding up his shiny gold trophy after his very first Little League baseball game. And in almost every single one of those cherished photographs, standing casually in the background, was Greg. Greg smiling at the birthday parties. Greg holding a beer at the backyard summer barbecues. Greg clapping loudly at Bradley's high school graduation. The sickening realization twisted a rusted knife deep into my gut. My entire existence, my fundamental identity as a loving father, was nothing but a cruel, elaborate illusion. I had spent my life raising another man's child, feeding and clothing the living proof of my wife's absolute betrayal. The tears that silently rolled down my weathered cheeks were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. But as I closed the heavy leather album, a new terrifying calm washed over me. The agonizing, suffocating pain of my shattered heart was finally completely gone, leaving absolutely nothing behind except a cold, calculated, unyielding thirst for absolute justice against the people who deliberately destroyed my life. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the silent house. I was still sitting in my dark study, the heavy leather photo album resting on the floor beside my boots. My eyes were fixed on the locked drawer of my desk, my mind racing through 3 decades of fabricated memories. Suddenly, the cheap plastic burner phone in my shirt pocket vibrated with a sharp, abrupt buzz. I pulled it out, my thumb hovering over the glowing screen. It was an encrypted email from the private genetics laboratory. I took a slow, deep breath, bracing myself for the final impact, and tapped the notification. The digital document loaded instantly, displaying a stark, highly clinical report filled with complex medical jargon and alphanumeric sequences. I scrolled past the dense scientific methodology, my eyes scanning frantically for the final conclusion at the bottom of the page. There it was, printed in plain, undeniable black text. The probability of paternity is 0%. The subject tested shares no biological relationship with the provider of the reference sample. I read that single sentence over and over again until the words lost their shape. 0%. Not a mistake. Not a statistical anomaly. 0. The boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. The boy I had worked myself to the bone to provide for, the boy who currently sat in my executive chair, did not possess a single drop of my blood. I lowered the phone, the cold reality settling over me like a heavy shroud. Just as I closed my eyes to absorb the crushing blow, the device in my hand vibrated again. It was a phone call from Harrison. I pressed the answer button and brought the receiver to my ear, the silence in the room suddenly feeling completely suffocating. "Rick, did you get the laboratory report?" Harrison asked, his gravelly voice cutting through the heavy darkness. "Yes," I whispered, my voice sounding completely hollow even to my own ears. "He is not mine." Harrison let out a slow, steady exhale. "I know, Rick. And I know exactly whose he is." The private investigator proceeded to lay out the final, devastating pieces of the puzzle he had uncovered over the last several hours. While I was sitting in my study looking at old photographs, Harrison had been tracking my wife. Diane had told me she was going out to meet her friends for a late afternoon lunch and some light shopping. But Harrison had followed her silver sedan straight into the heart of the city. She did not go to a restaurant. She drove directly to the ultra-luxury residential high-rise. She parked in the secure underground garage and took the private elevator straight up to the $3 million penthouse. The penthouse owned entirely by Gregory Mitchell. Harrison did not stop there. He had utilized his underground contacts to dig deep into municipal travel records, old credit card statements, and private hotel registries dating back over 30 years. He painted a perfectly clear, horrifying picture of a parallel life lived entirely in the shadows. Diane and Greg had been carrying on an intensive, unbroken romantic affair since the very first year of my marriage. They had secretly traveled together while I was working double shifts on freezing construction sites. They had shared quiet anniversary dinners on the exact nights I thought she was visiting her sick mother. And 30 years ago, when Diane announced she was pregnant, they both knew exactly who the real father was. But Greg was just a junior accountant back then, struggling to pay off his student loans. He could not offer Diane the lavish, comfortable life she so desperately craved. So they made a calculated, monstrous decision. They decided to let me claim the child. They allowed me to believe I was the proud father of a baby boy. They watched with quiet amusement as I poured every single ounce of my youth, my physical health, and my burning ambition into building a massive commercial empire for my supposed family. I was never a husband to Diane. I was never a best friend to Greg. And I was certainly never a father to Bradley. I was nothing more than a blind, heavily burdened workhorse pulling their golden carriage. I was the dedicated cash cow completely funding their extravagant secret lives and building the $8 million kingdom they were currently standing in. Harrison explained that over the years, Greg had quietly mentored Bradley, subtly grooming his own biological son to eventually take over the construction company. That was why Bradley possessed the exact same ruthless, calculating demeanor as the accountant. They were cut from the exact same cloth. And now that the company was highly successful, now that the millions of dollars had been quietly siphoned into offshore accounts, and now that Bradley was officially the chief executive officer, my usefulness had completely expired. The fake wedding with the luxury escort was the final act of their elaborate theater. It was designed to secure my final massive financial gift before they discarded me. Tuesday was not just a legal maneuver to steal my money. It was a vicious house cleaning. They were planning to lock the burdensome old workhorse in a psychiatric ward, so the real family, Diane, Greg, and Bradley, could finally emerge from the shadows and live out in the open with my stolen fortune. I thanked Harrison for his incredible work and ended the call, placing the burner phone quietly onto the surface of my wooden desk. The pain and the humiliation that had threatened to drown me just hours ago were completely incinerated. I stood up from my leather chair feeling stronger and more lucid than I had in 20 years. Every single ounce of love I had ever held for those three people was dead, replaced by a cold, absolute, and terrifying clarity. I was no longer a victim waiting to be slaughtered. I was the architect of the very empire they were trying to steal, and I knew exactly how to tear the entire structure down on top of their heads. The deadline was approaching fast, but they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had invited me to a final family dinner on Sunday night, intending to celebrate my impending demise. They expected to see a broken, drugged, and confused old man sitting at the head of the table. Instead, I was going to serve them a feast of absolute ruin. Sunday evening arrived with a heavy, unnatural stillness. The sprawling suburban house was filled with the rich, savory aroma of roasted lamb and rosemary. It was Diane's signature dish, the one she always prepared for highly specific, joyful celebrations. Tonight, they were secretly celebrating my impending funeral. I stood at the top of the grand oak staircase, adjusting the collar of my worn flannel shirt. I listened to the bright, cheerful laughter echoing up from the formal dining room below. For the past 48 hours, I had meticulously coordinated every single detail of my counterattack with Mitchell and Harrison. Every legal document was drafted and signed. Every illegal offshore wire transfer was tracked and heavily documented. The local police authorities and the federal investigators were already fully briefed and waiting on standby. I took one final deep breath, actively forcing my heart rate to slow down. I smoothed my facial expression into the vacant, tired, and deeply confused mask of a dying old man. I gripped the wooden banister and slowly began my descent down the stairs. When I shuffled quietly into the brightly lit dining room, the sickening reality of the scene struck me with a heavy physical force. Sitting comfortably around my massive mahogany table was the actual family. Diane was wearing a stunning dark silk dress, elegantly pouring a deep red vintage wine into expensive crystal glasses. Sitting directly across from her was Greg, my trusted corporate accountant, and her secret lover of 3 decades. He was wearing a sharp, tailored blazer and smiling with the relaxed, arrogant confidence of a king waiting to be officially crowned. Next to him sat Bradley, the treacherous son, who shared his biological blood and his ruthless, unyielding greed. And right beside Bradley was Victoria, the high-end luxury escort who was currently playing the lucrative role of the sweet, modest bride named Megan. They were laughing warmly together, sharing quiet inside jokes, completely at ease in the massive fortress I had built with my own broken back. They looked like a picture-perfect, wealthy family enjoying a Sunday supper. When Diane finally noticed me standing silently in the doorway, her bright laughter instantly died. It was immediately replaced by that flawless, sickeningly sweet mask of deep maternal concern. "Oh, Rick, darling, you are awake," she cooed softly, rushing over to gently take my arm. "Come sit down. We were just about to start the dinner without you." Greg stood up from his chair and offered me a warm, deeply sympathetic nod. "It is so good to see you, old friend," Greg said, his voice dripping with a calculated, highly patronizing pity. "You are looking a bit tired tonight." I forced my large hands to tremble slightly as Diane carefully guided me to the heavy carved armchair at the very head of the dining table. I mumbled a weak, incoherent greeting, keeping my eyes fixed mostly on the empty white porcelain plate resting directly in front of me. The lavish dinner formally began, and I sat in total, unbroken silence, quietly observing the monsters feeding at my table. Greg proudly raised his crystal glass, the dark ruby wine catching the bright light of the crystal chandelier above us. "To family," he declared smoothly, looking directly into Diane's brown eyes with a sickeningly intimate, knowing smirk, and to a very bright, very prosperous future for all of us. Bradley eagerly clinked his glass against Greg's, a massive, greedy grin spreading rapidly across his face. Absolutely, Bradley agreed loudly. Big changes are coming to the firm this week. The company is going to reach entirely new heights once we finally trim the unnecessary dead weight. I watched them drink my expensive wine, eating the rich food paid for by my decades of agonizing sweat. The bitter irony of the situation was absolutely suffocating. Greg and Bradley casually discussed the upcoming fiscal quarter, openly talking about aggressive corporate expansion plans and heavily restructuring the executive board. They spoke with absolute freedom, acting as if I was already dead and buried in the ground. They did not even bother to lower their voices, entirely confident that the heavy chemical fog inside my brain rendered me completely deaf and blind to their blatant treason. Megan, or rather Victoria, delicately cut her roasted lamb, occasionally resting her perfectly manicured hand on Bradley's arm. She complained briefly about the terrible traffic in the financial district, casually mentioning a high-end designer boutique she had visited that afternoon. She was entirely dropping her humble poor farm girl persona, now that she truly believed the confused old man sitting at the head of the table was mentally gone. Halfway through the decadent meal, Diane reached over and gently patted my rough hand. She placed a small, delicate porcelain dish right next to my crystal water glass. Inside the dish sat the 3 familiar deadly capsules, 2 chalky white, 1 muddy green. The highly dangerous chemical poison meant to guarantee my total mental failure on Tuesday morning. "Do not forget to take your special vitamins, sweetheart," she whispered tenderly, brushing a stray hair from my forehead. "We really need you to be strong and healthy for your big doctor's appointment." I looked down at the poisonous pills. I looked up at Diane's sweet, deceptive face. Then I slowly looked down the length of the long mahogany table at Greg Bradley and the heavily paid actress. They were all pausing their conversations, watching me intently, eagerly waiting for the stupid, obedient beast of burden to swallow his daily poison. But I was no longer the blind beast. I was the absolute master of this house. The invisible steel trap was officially closed. The ruthless predators sitting inside my formal dining room had absolutely no idea they were already bleeding out. I simply stared at the pills, a cold, terrifying calm washing over my entire body. It was finally time for me to execute my absolute judgment on all of them tonight. The air in the dining room hung thick with anticipation. 4 pairs of eyes tracked my every movement, waiting for the frail, broken old man to swallow the poison that would officially end his life. Diane leaned in slightly, her lips parted in a soft, encouraging smile. Bradley tapped his fingers impatiently against the polished mahogany table. Greg watched over his wine glass, a predator waiting for the final snare to snap shut. But I did not reach for the small porcelain dish. I did not let my hands shake. Instead, I slowly reached out and picked up the crystal water glass. My grip was steady. The water inside did not ripple or spill. I took a calm sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the tension in my throat. Then I set the glass down with a firm, deliberate thud that echoed through the quiet room. The sudden sound made Victoria flinch slightly. I placed my large hands flat against the edge of the table and pushed my chair back. Slowly, methodically, I stood up. I did not hunch my shoulders. I did not let my knees buckle. I drew myself up to my full imposing height, expanding my chest and looking down at the people seated around my table. The pathetic, confused mask completely melted away from my face, revealing the hard, unforgiving steel beneath. The abrupt physical transformation was so startling that a heavy, stunned silence fell over the room. Diane blinked rapidly, her manicured eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Rick, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice faltering slightly. "Sit back down. You are going to lose your balance." I did not listen to her. I did not even look at her. I turned my gaze directly to Greg, who was still holding his glass of red wine in the air for his arrogant toast. "Put the glass down, Greg," I said. My voice was no longer raspy or weak. It resonated with the deep, commanding authority of a man who had spent 4 decades ordering construction crews across massive steel frameworks. The sudden power in my tone struck the table like a physical blow. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arrogant smirk faltering into a look of deep uncertainty. "Dad, seriously, sit down," Bradley snapped, trying to reclaim his dominance. "You are having an episode. You need to take your medication right now." I ignored my treacherous son entirely. I turned slowly and walked away from the dining table, stepping onto the plush carpet of the expansive living room that opened directly into the dining area. My footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and coordinated. I walked over to the sleek glass side table and picked up the dark, heavy remote control for the massive 80-inch television mounted on the center wall. The screen was positioned so that anyone sitting at the dining table had an unobstructed view. Diane stood up from her chair, her silk dress rustling loudly in the tense silence. "Rick, you are scaring me," she pleaded, her voice rising in a manufactured panic. "Please let me help you back to bed. Let us call the doctor." I turned around to face them, the television remote gripped firmly in my right hand. "We do not need to call the doctor, Diane," I replied coldly, my eyes locking onto hers. "The doctor has already been paid off, has he not?" The blood drained from Diane's face. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Greg slowly lowered his wine glass to the table, his calculating eyes suddenly widening with the spark of genuine fear. I raised my hand, pointed the remote directly at the dark screen, and pressed the power button. The massive television flashed brightly to life. I had already set the input channel and turned the expensive surround sound system up to its maximum volume. The grainy high-definition footage of the restaurant VIP lounge filled the glowing screen. The hidden camera video began to play immediately. Every single speaker in the room suddenly boomed with the sharp, clear audio of Saturday night. There was Bradley lounging arrogantly on the leather sofa. The deafening sound of my son scoffing filled the dining room. "Well, the old man finally coughed it up," the digital Bradley sneered from the speakers, tossing the $500,000 cashier's check onto the table. 500 grand. Not bad for a night of playing the dutiful, loving son. Bradley gasped violently, pushing his dining chair back as he stared at the television. Victoria covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. But the video continued playing mercilessly, broadcasting their darkest secrets into the bright room. The massive screen showed Diane handing over the thick manila folder. Her crisp, chilling voice echoed off the dining room walls, amplified by the heavy speakers. "He signed it. He thinks it is the marriage witness certificate. The poor senile fool did not even put on his reading glasses. It is the full medical power of attorney. By Tuesday, we put him in the facility. The doctor is already paid off and waiting for our call." I pressed the pause button, freezing the massive image on Diane's triumphant, treacherous smile. The sudden silence that followed the loud video was absolutely suffocating. It was heavier than wet concrete. I slowly lowered the remote control and looked back at the dining table. The arrogant, celebratory atmosphere had been completely incinerated. The smug smiles were entirely gone, replaced by expressions of sheer, paralyzed terror. Diane collapsed back into her chair, her hands shaking violently as she stared at the frozen image of her own betrayal. Bradley looked like he had just been physically struck by a speeding truck. He was gripping the edge of the table, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Greg, the master manipulator, was frozen. His face was pale gray, his mind trying to comprehend how his trap had been shattered. They realized their demise. I walked back to the heavy mahogany dining table, my footsteps ringing out in the utterly silent room. No one dared to move a muscle. I reached inside the inner breast pocket of my flannel jacket and pulled out a meticulously organized stack of folded documents. I did not yell. I did not scream, curse, or flip the table in a blind rage. True power does not ever need to raise its voice. I looked directly at Diane, whose pale face was stained with terrified tears, and dropped the first document onto the polished wood. It was the certified toxicology report. I kept my voice completely level. I told her I knew exactly what she had been secretly putting into my morning vitamins for the past 4 months. I calmly described the heavy sedatives and the dangerous cognitive inhibitors. I told her attempting to chemically induce dementia to falsely imprison a healthy man in a locked psychiatric ward was a severe premeditated felony. I watched her manicured hands tremble violently as she stared down at the damning chemical breakdown. The flawless mask of the loving, devoted wife was shattered, leaving behind nothing but a cornered criminal. I turned my cold gaze to Greg, sweating profusely in his expensive, tailored blazer. I dropped the second thick stack of papers directly in front of his empty wine glass. These were the highly confidential offshore wire transfer logs and shadow ledgers Mitchell expertly extracted from the compromised vendor portal. I watched Greg's calculating eyes frantically scan the bright red numbers. I told him I knew everything about the phantom construction materials, the ghost subcontractors, and the $4 million currently sitting in the Cayman Islands. I informed him the federal authorities took a very dim view of massive corporate embezzlement across international borders. Bradley suddenly lunged forward, his face flushed with a desperate, panicked rage. He opened his mouth to loudly shift the blame entirely onto the accountant, just as I knew his cowardly nature would dictate. But I cut him off by dropping the third and final document onto the center of the table. It was the expedited DNA paternity test. I looked at the boy I lovingly raised, the boy who relentlessly mocked me and plotted to destroy my entire life, and I told him the absolute, unvarnished truth. I told him his probability of being my biological son was exactly 0%. I watched the arrogant chief executive officer crumble into jagged pieces as I revealed the corrupt accountant sitting across the table from him was his actual biological father. The shock that violently rippled through Bradley's body was incredibly palpable. He snapped his head toward Diane, his eyes silently begging her to tell him it was a ridiculous lie. But Diane simply buried her face in her hands and began to sob uncontrollably. I looked over at the high-end luxury escort who called herself Megan. I addressed her by her real name, Victoria, and told her that her lucrative acting contract with my family was officially terminated. The grand elaborate theater production was finally over. The heavy curtain had permanently fallen on their 30 years of disgusting deception. Before any of them could muster a single word of defense, the heavy front doors of my sprawling suburban estate were violently kicked open. The loud, terrifying sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed down the long hallway. Heavy tactical boots pounded aggressively against the polished hardwood floors. Mitchell strode confidently into the dining room, looking immaculate in his sharp suit, flanked by a dozen heavily armed federal agents and local police officers. The authorities swarmed the room with a swift, calculated precision. A massive officer grabbed Bradley by the shoulders, forcefully spinning him around and slamming him face first against the dining room wall. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly as they rapidly read him his Miranda rights, arresting him for massive corporate fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. Bradley screamed loudly, thrashing wildly against the arresting officers, crying out for his mother and his real father to save him. But they were entirely helpless. 2 federal agents approached Greg, pulling his arms roughly behind his back. The arrogant king of the shadows was instantly reduced to a whimpering coward, begging the stern officers to let him call his personal attorney. They ignored his pathetic pleas, dragging him toward the front door to face a mandatory life sentence in a federal prison. Diane was completely hysterical. She dropped to her knees right there in the dining room, her expensive silk dress pooling messily on the floor. She reached out with her trembling hands, desperately grabbing onto the fabric of my flannel trousers, sobbing loudly, and begging me for mercy. She swore she still loved me, claiming it was all a terrible mistake she deeply regretted. I looked down at the woman who shared my bed for over 3 decades, the woman who actively poisoned my mind and plotted my execution without a second thought. I stepped back firmly, completely untangling myself from her desperate grasp. I looked her dead in the eyes and told the arresting officers to get the attempted murderer out of my sight. Amidst the absolute chaos of the simultaneous arrests, Victoria saw a tiny window of opportunity. The high-end escort dropped her designer handbag, kicked off her expensive high heels, and sprinted frantically toward the glass doors leading out to the back patio. She dashed out into the cool night air, desperately trying to escape the massive federal sweep, but she did not even make it to the edge of the manicured lawn. Harrison emerged silently from the dark shadows, his massive frame completely blocking her only path to freedom. He grabbed her firmly by the arm, marching her right back inside the brightly lit house, handing her directly over to the waiting local police officers. My absolute, unyielding revenge was finally complete, leaving behind nothing but a scorched earth. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers slowly faded down the long, winding driveway, casting long, shifting shadows against the tall oak trees. I stood alone in the grand foyer of my sprawling mansion, listening to the sudden, absolute silence that settled over the property. The house was completely empty. For the very first time in 35 years, there were no carefully orchestrated lies echoing through the quiet hallways. There were no hidden enemies pretending to love me. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for months was finally gone. I walked slowly back into the formal dining room. The lavish Sunday supper still sat half-eaten on the polished mahogany table. The crystal wine glasses were still half full, but the monsters who had been feeding at my table were gone, locked safely inside cold steel cages where they belonged. I looked at the dark television screen on the wall, the instrument of their ultimate undoing, and felt a profound sense of peace wash over my tired soul. The following morning, I met with Mitchell one final time in his downtown high-rise office. The ruthless corporate attorney looked exceptionally satisfied as he slid a thick stack of finalized legal documents across the glass desk. Over the past 48 hours, while my betrayers sat languishing in holding cells, we had completely dismantled the entire Sullivan construction empire. I had legally dissolved the company, liquidated every single physical asset, and sold off the massive commercial equipment. My entire $8 million fortune was immediately transferred into an ironclad, irrevocable charitable trust. I established a foundation dedicated entirely to providing trade school scholarships for underprivileged youth, giving struggling kids the exact same chance to build a solid life that I had fought so hard for. I made absolutely certain that the trust was legally untouchable. Diane, Greg, and Bradley were completely cut off from every single penny. They would wake up in prison facing decades of federal sentences, completely drowning in massive legal debts, with absolutely zero financial resources to hire competent defense attorneys. Mitchell shook my hand firmly, expressing his deep respect for a man who chose to burn his own kingdom to the ground rather than surrender it to a pack of greedy wolves. I walked out of that glass building feeling completely liberated. I returned to the silent suburban estate one last time. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom and pulled a single weathered leather duffel bag from the back of the closet. I did not pack the expensive tailored suits Diane had bought for me to wear to our country club dinners. I did not pack the expensive gold watches or the meaningless symbols of a fabricated wealthy life. I packed a few pairs of sturdy jeans, my old flannel shirts, and my heavy scuffed work boots. I walked downstairs and placed the heavy brass keys to the mansion directly on the center of the marble kitchen island. I did not look back as I walked out the heavy front door. I climbed into the cab of my reliable truck, the only possession I truly cared to keep, and started the rumbling engine. As I drove down the empty highway, the first golden rays of the morning sun began to break over the distant horizon, piercing through the dark, lingering clouds. I was a 70-year-old man, with no family, no home, and no massive corporate empire to my name. But as the warm sunlight hit my weathered face, I realized I was richer than I had been in 30 years. I was finally completely free. If you are listening to my voice right now, I need you to remember one vital, undeniable truth about this life. Never ignore the quiet, persistent warnings of your own intuition. When your gut screams at you that something is fundamentally wrong in your own home, you must listen to it. I spent months blindly making excuses for the people I loved, desperately trying to ignore the terrifying red flags, because the truth was simply too agonizing to face. But the truth is the only weapon that can ever truly set you free. We are socially conditioned to believe that blood ties and marriage vows are absolute unbreakable bonds. We are taught to sacrifice our own sanity and our own resources to protect our family members, no matter how terribly they treat us. But blood does not automatically grant someone the right to manipulate your mind, steal your hard-earned legacy, or strip away your basic human dignity. The family you accidentally get through genetics or a flawed marriage certificate is not always the family you deserve. Sometimes the most courageous thing a man can do is walk away from the people he loves the most. It takes a massive amount of strength to look at the smoking ashes of your ruined life and decide to start completely over. But I promise you, there is incredible beauty waiting on the other side of that terrifying fire. You can always rebuild your life. You can always find a new purpose. Today, my money is helping young, ambitious kids learn honest trades and build their own futures. My legacy is no longer attached to a treacherous son or a deceitful wife. It is attached to pure, unselfish kindness. I may have lost the people I thought were my family, but I ultimately saved my own soul. Did my story resonate with you today? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to save your own peace of mind? Please let me know in the comments section below and tell me where in the world you are watching from. If you found value in my journey, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another life story. Thank you for your sweet support and for listening to my truth. See you next time.